Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, AMU, Aligarh. Now, we have been talking about the origin of state, and in that original state, we are discussing the social contract theory, how social contract theory contributed in the origin of the state itself. And in that, we have already discussed about Thomas Hobbes, his theory of contract, then John Locke, and today I'm going to talk about the Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the contract which brought about the state into existence. Now, Rousseau, the first French writer of the 18th century, he elaborated his theory in his famous work, The Social Contract, which was published in 1762. Now, Rousseau, unlike his English predecessors, Hobbes and Locke, had no purpose to serve and no definite cause to uphold, although his teachings inspired the French Revolution of 1789. His object was to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and good of each association, and in which, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain free as before. So Rousseau wanted to offer a logical explanation of the nature of the civil society, that is the state, though his logic is lost in his discussion in epigram and paradoxes that in which he talks about, and often he indulges in his creation, that is a social contract. So this was natural because Rousseau was a man with abnormally intense feeling and emotions, and he had a vivid imagination, warm sympathies, and he stated many of his ideas in abstracts, and that makes understanding difficult. But still, we are going to talk about the evolution of state and its origin through different processes. Just like other contractualists, Hobbes and Locke, he was talking about human nature, then state of nature, and then contract itself. And with that contract, the state that came into existence and what was its nature and form. Now, Rousseau disagrees with both Hobbes and Locke in his analysis of human nature and agrees with Plato, maintaining that human nature is essentially good. So, man is a noble savage, a mixture of two primal instincts, self love and sympathy. So, he has a conscience which is guided by reason in determining what is right and what is wrong. This also avoids any possibility of conflict between self love and sympathy, or self regarding or other regarding primal instincts of man. Human being, though essentially good in nature, they may deviate from his nature because of bad social environment, which is there because of denigration in art and culture and artificial society. So Rousseau's great contribution can be summed up as that he does not blame the individual for the degradation that has taken place in human nature, and he finds the causes in the ills of society and blames society and social environment for the bad nature of the individual. So shortcomings of society led to shortcomings in human behavior and not vice versa. So the implication of this view of human nature and relationship of man and society are very clear. So if man is essentially good and because of bad social conditions he had become bad, obviously the solution lies in changing society and the social environment. And if on the other hand it is thought that man is a bad creature, then the solution lies in purifying the soul and not in changing the social setup. So thus the first view, which is upheld by Rousseau, demands that society must be changed, and therefore ills of society are progressive in view of the relationship of man and society. So state of nature that he talks about is the nature, and in that Rousseau says is quite unclear. According to him, the state of nature was always better than civil society. Now, Rousseau's natural man, his noble savage, as he calls it, he lived a solitary, happy, carefree, speechless, and dress free life. He was free, he was equal, he was independent, self sufficient, and thoroughly contented. He was neither social nor antisocial, merely a social. So he had neither family nor property, and the concept of rights was also missing in the state of nature. The paradise like freedom of state of nature came to an end with the increase in population and emergence of feeling of mine and thine, and with that came the private property. Now, because of scarcity, consequence of the growth of population, the concept of private property emerged, and with that, the whole piece of the state of nature vanished due to this inequality, jealousy, conflict, selfishness, competition, and all undesirable element in the human nature emerged. So, property led to the enslavement of man by few, egoism of individuals, and so called civilized society transformed a simple, honest, sympathetic, noble, and savage individual into dishonest, selfish, clever, egoistic, and cultured fellow. So, Rousseau's A Man in the State of Nature was a noble savage who led a life of primitive simplicity and idyllic happiness. He was independent, he was contented, he was self sufficient, he was healthy, he was fearless, and without need of his fellow or desire to harm them. It was only the primitive instinct and sympathy which united him with others. He knew neither right nor wrong and was always away from all notions of virtue and vice. So it was thus a pure, simple, and innocent life of perfect freedom and equality which Rousseau's man enjoyed in the state of nature. They were as they were as yet free from the spiritless influence of civilization, and they sought their own happiness, which was untrammeled by social laws and institutions. But these conditions could not last for long. So, two things emerged to corrupt this perfect scene in which the man found itself into. One was increase in population, and the other was dawn of reason. Now, with the increase in population, economic progress moved apace. The primitive life of simplicity and happiness disappeared. Fixed homes established. The family institution of property followed. And now all these developments, it sounded the death knell of human equality. So man began to think in terms of what is his and what is others, mine and thine. So by nature, man scarcely thinks, and the one who reflects is a corrupt creature. So mine and thine feeling makes an individual think. So when man began to think in terms of mine and thine, there emerged the institution of private property. The first man who, after enclosing a piece of ground, bethought himself to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. So, the whole process of development may best be described in the words of Dunning when he says, "The arts of agriculture and metallurgy were discovered, and in the application of them, men had need of one another's aid. So, cooperation revealed and emphasized the diversity of man's talent and prepared thus the inevitable result. And the stronger man did the greater amount of work, and the craftier got more of the product. Now, thus appeared the difference of rich and poor, the prolific source of all other source of inequality. So, emergence of civil society is here. The equality and the happiness of early state was lost. Mankind was rapidly into a state of war, resembling almost that of the state of Hobbes' state of nature. So, war, murder, then wretchedness, and the horror that had been unknown in the savage stage of life of individual earlier, it became universal now. So the rich and the poor were ranged against each other in unrelenting hostility. That was a disquieting state of affairs, and every individual became anxious to get rid of it. And the escape was found in the form of civil society. So the natural freedom gave place to civil freedom by a social contract of each with all and all with each. So as a result of this, a contract, a multitude of individuals became a collective unit, that is a society. So the contract placed every individual in complete dependence on others, complete though mutual and equal, and the individual in Rousseau's political system puts all his person, all his power in common under the supreme direction of general will. And in this corporate capacity, he received each member as an indivisible part of the whole. So there was only one contract, according to Rousseau, which was at once social and political. So individual surrendered himself completely and unconditionally to the will of the body of men, which became a, a state, and others became a member into it. So the body so created was moral, it was a collective body, and Rousseau called it a general will. So the natural man in the state of universe was absolutely independent of others. The only difference between the two was that with Rousseau, he was not at war with others, although eventually when equality and happiness of early stage of nature was lost, Rousseau's mankind too. Again, there was only one contract by which each individual surrendered all his rights, and the authority of the sovereign on whom or to whom rights had been surrendered was strongly reminiscent of Hobbes's. So for Rousseau, it was the general will which was sovereign. For Rousseau, it was the ultimate sovereign authority, but for Hobbes, it was the king. But once Rousseau established the unlimited, all embracing, unalienable, and general, indivisible will, powers according to as sovereign power in the general will, he endowed it with as much absolute Hobbes had given to his sovereign monarch. So similarly, to Rousseau could neither be wrong nor unjust. It could even force the individual will to its own point of view. Now, are these not conclusions sounding similar to those of Hobbes's? So the only difference is that in the case of Hobbes, these are the attributes of a king, whereas with Rousseau, they belong to general will. So the creation of new society needed a social contract. Since no man had any natural authority over his fellows, and since force alone bestowed no right, all legitimate authority among men must be now based on these covenants. So the contract was entered into by all men, like Hobbes, but sovereignty was not entrusted to any Leviathan. Here, in Rousseau's case, only to general will, that is, a collective will, wishing well of the whole society. So individuals, they surrendered their rights by saying, each one of us put into the community his person and all his powers under the supreme direction of the general will. And as a body, they all said we cooperate and we incorporate also every members as an indivisible part of the whole. Thus, a new sovereign authority known as general will was entrusted with all the power of and over individual. Now, this general will was the state which they had created. Now, here we find that Rousseau does not distinguish between state and society. He identifies sovereignty of the state with the general will of society or with the common interest of the community. Now, this sovereign general will is the supreme and absolute power. Against this, no individual can be given any right, and this will is infallible, indivisible, unrepresentable, and unlimited. And the state sovereignty of Rousseau is absolute, like that of Hobbes's, with the difference that whereas Hobbes assigned sovereignty to the head of the state, one or many, Rousseau gives it to the whole community. In fact, Rousseau's philosophic doctrine of popular sovereignty is an amalgamation of absolute sovereignty of Hobbes and the popular consent of Locke. So, popular sovereignty of Rousseau was in a way compromise between these two, that is, absolutism of Hobbes and constitutionalism of John Locke. So, Rousseau assigns indivisible and absolute power to his sovereign. It is because it is the people who are at once the subject over whom absolutism is exercised and the sovereign who exercises this absolutism. So, absolutism of general will in Rousseau is based on consent rather than on fear and coercion, as it is in Hobbes's case. So, Rousseau's sovereign state is as unlimited and absolute and centralized as that of Hobbes's Leviathan, but it's a Leviathan whose head has been chopped off because he no longer resembles like a Leviathan, but still it's a Leviathan. So at times he seems to suggest here that general will is to be sought only when all unanimously agree. And he holds that the will of all is something very different from the general will. The will of all, he says, is a mere total of selfish and casually coincident wills. So, how this general will is to be formed? That was the question. And at the time, he implies that it is the majority will. Though at other places, he tells us that this can only be so if all the characteristics of general will are still in majority. That is, at times it appears that the residual left after cancelling out the differences expressed by all citizens is to be regarded as the general will. So Rousseau is thus very vague, and what he tells us about the general will, so much vagueness about something is uh, important as finding the general will, observes Viper, saying that it is to be regretted. Rousseau, who has told us so much about general will, has still not told us enough. Indeed, he has left us in such a position that nobody can be sure what the general will is on any particular point. So, talking about general will further, the unique feature of general will was that it was represented it represented the collective good as distinguished from the private interest of its members, and it was the will of all citizens when they were willing not for their own private but the general good. So it was the voice of all for the good of all. So Rousseau went further and said that my will, which willed the best interest of the society, was the best will, and it was indeed more real than my will, which willed my private interest. So all actions were the result of the will, but my will for the good of the state was morally superior than any other will, private or associational, which might from time to time determine my conduct. So the general will being the compound of the best wills of all citizens, willing the best interests of the community and its lasting welfare, and it must be sovereign. Now, Rousseau differentiates actual, real, and general will just to make it clear what general will finally represented. So, actual will is based on self-interest and it is not related to well-being of society. It's an irrational will which is narrow and self-conflicting. On the other hand, real will is a rational will which favors one's real interest in relation to the common welfare of the whole community. It is not based on self-interest and does not strive for the good of any individual, but for the common good or interest. Now, in this way, Rousseau's sovereignty is popular sovereignty, where every individual is a ruler as well as the ruled. Now, sovereignty, as Rousseau writes, must both come from all and apply to all. So, according to Bosang, general will is the will of the whole society as such, or the will of the individual as far as they aim at the common end. Similarly, T.H. Green maintains that general will is the common consciousness of the common end. And Viper says the general will is thus the will of the citizen when they are willing not their private interest but the general good. So it is the voice of all for the good of all. Now, further, if you try to distinguish the features of general will, and we find that since it is my will, my own real will, I ought to follow it. If I did not, because some private or selfish interest induced me not to follow it, then the general will could legitimately compel me to obey it. Indeed, it was the only authority that could legitimately coerce me, for it was my own will coming back to me, even though I did not always recognize it as such. And in following it, I was fulfilling myself and was thus finding true freedom. Now, that was the logic given, and whoever refused to obey the general will would be compelled to do so by the whole body of the community. Now, this means nothing less than that he will be forced to follow the general will and to be free. And for this is the condition which secures him against all personal dependence. Now, general will, though by definition it could only deal with the matter of public, not private interest, was alone the judge of what constitute public or private interest. So general will, moreover, could not allow anything stand between it and the complete loyalty of all its citizens. Further, the features we find that other associations in the state, other than the state, should not exist, but if they must, they always be subordinate. And if any conflict of loyalty did ever arise or ever occur, the custodian citizens of the state must always obey the interest of the community, that is general will. Now, the general will must also, Rousseau said, be inalienable and indivisible. Hence, it could not be represented in parliamentary institutions. And as soon as a nation appoints representative, he says, fit it no longer, it is no longer the general will. So England, he declared, was only free during elections, after which it enslaved and counts for nothing. Nor could the general will be delegated in any manner whatever. Any attempt to delegate it would mean it's ended. So the moment there is a master, there is no longer a sovereign. So general will, adds Rousseau, is infallible. It is always right and conducive to the public advantage. Moreover, by obeying the general will, the individual simply obeys his own will. Nor can the individual complain against any kind of coercion or real coercion, Rousseau says, never occurs in society. Even a criminal wills his own punishment under general will. So Rousseau made a clear distinction between government and the sovereign, that is the general will. He says the general will could not be an executive will. And the people who were sovereign ought not to be responsible for the details of a government. And those who made the laws, they should not carry it out. For it was the characteristics of sovereign general will that it must be impersonal, and the decree of government might frequently be particular and personal. So Rousseau meant by government only the executive power. Law making was not a function of government, but that of the sovereign. So people entrusted their executive power to their agent. The government was thus only a subordinate authority, the result of the decree of the sovereign, not the creation of the contract. So, for Rousseau, law is not the will of a class, but the will of the whole nation. And this will, he said, is to be discovered simply by asking the nation to meet together and declare it. Only when he says, I actively assist in legislation, I am really a citizen and genuinely free. And since the fewer the citizens are, more weightier my voice has amongst them. So Rousseau believed in the direct democracy, the direct government by citizens who would themselves, in public making, make the laws without being betrayed by elected representatives. Now, his choice of direct democracy among the forms of government was largely based upon the Swiss cantons, which he knew were the ancient Greek city states of which he had read law. Accordingly, an expression of general will, which is the will of the society for the common good. It therefore demands the respect, but the common good is also the good. So finally, in obeying the law, I am pursuing my own best interest and achieving what really I will. So it is to law alone that man owe justice and liberty. It is celestial voice which dictates to each citizen the percepts of public reason and teaches them to act according to the rules of his own judgment, not to behave inconsistently with himself. Now, another important result of the contract is that life and liberty of each individual of the community is secured and founded on the general will of the society as a whole. Equality and liberty, Rousseau said, are ensured because each individual makes a complete surrender of himself and all his rights to the community. And while doing so, he receives his person and right back again and as indivisible part of the sovereign community. And Rousseau said, since each gives himself up to all, he gives himself to none, as there is acquired acquired over every associate the same right that is given up by himself. There is gained, there is a gain kind of a thing, equivalent of what is lost, with greater power to preserve what is left. So each individual thus has a dual capacity. He is both a member of a sovereign body and also a subject. So he is sovereign as he himself is an integral unit of the community. So he is subject because he must obey the general will, and the general will stands for public interest. Now, in evaluation, we find that Rousseau was apostle of popular sovereignty, and the secret of his political philosophy is found in the substitution for the sovereign of the word general will. He justified revolutions against arbitrary rule and was the pioneer to preach the ideals of democracy. And for that, the Sedgwick says that the characteristics of Rousseau's revolutionary doctrine of popular sovereignty is that it rests on three very simple principles. First, that men are by nature free and equal, and secondly, that the right of government must be based on some contract freely entered into by these equal and independent individuals, and third, that only contract at one just once just to the individual becomes an indivisible part of a body that retains an inalienable right of determining its own internal constitution and legislation, that is, a sovereign people. Now, if you see what Rousseau contributed, so Rousseau brings into prominence the idea of consent, establishes once and for all that will, not force, is the basis of the state. He also champions the cause of direct democracy by vesting the legislative power in the people. So Rousseau's political teachings had a profound appeal for the fathers of the Constitution of the United States of America and France, and to quote Dunning, Rousseau's spirit and dogmas, however disguised and transformed, are seen everywhere, both in the speculative system and in the governmental organizations of, of various countries after his death. So Rousseau died in 1778, but the main defect in Rousseau's philosophy is his explanation of the general will. He places no limit on the absolute power of the whole over its members. So Rousseau indeed gives no option to the individual will against the general will, which can neither be wrong nor unjust. Similarly, individuals cannot protest against the authority of the general will. Law, according to Rousseau, is the expression of the general will. If the individual suffers from punishment, say the death penalty, be it really a consenting party to his own execution, as he is a part of that sovereign will which made the law under which he is condemned. And Rousseau really tried to explain how a government can be justified, how men can submit to it, and yet remain free and not slave. He thought he could do that by showing that government is natural development as much as it is only in the state that men fulfill their capacities. Here he was preaching something which is fundamentally true and important, but unfortunately, Rousseau is often obscure, not always consistent. There is a vein of mysticism running through his doctrine. So he wrapped up the lesson he was trying to teach in the language that paved the way for totalitarianism. And totalitarianism is a hateful doctrine where the individual is asked to make complete surrender to some mystical entity called the general will and to a personal leader like could be Hitler or Mussolini. So then Rousseau does not differentiate between the state and society, and the fusion of two is a handy weapon with Rousseau's admirers in totalitarian states to suppress the individual, his aspirations, his personality, and finally, Rousseau's advocacy of small states with limited population and his categorical condemnation of representative institutions present practical difficulties. A direct democracy offers no solution for the political ills from which a nation state is believed to suffer first. Now, Rousseau had given this explanation, the contract and the reason for contract and the general will, the formation of state itself and the place of individual in that state. But with that, he has justified that it is the consent, the will of the people, that is the very reason for formation of the state. So in the origin of state, this concept that Rousseau propounded and proposed in front of us is a landmark in uh, diagnosing uh, the landmarks, finding out how the state finally originated and reached its present stage. So that was all for today. Thank you.